Today, you're going to learn everything you need to know about understanding props in React. We're going to cover what props are, how they work, a good way to think about props, destructuring props, default props, forwarding props, nesting props, and whether you should mutate props or not. So a little bit of a deep dive on props in React. And, if you're a beginner, great. This is going to be very good for you. I think it would be a good idea to understand components as well as JSX in React before this video, which I also have videos on, because I'm going to make some assumptions about knowledge there. But if you have a general idea of how kind of components work and how JSX works, this is going to be great for you. And then also, if you're more experienced with React, this is also going to probably be pretty good review for you, as I know that for me personally, I've been using React for several years now, but it was still good to kind of go deep dive and research props in React to kind of create this video. So let's first head over to VS Code, and I'm going to show you what props are just by example here first. So we have this home component, and that's what's rendering here on the screen. And then we also have this info card component. So this component, all it does is it renders out a title as well as some content. So if we go to our home page and I render out this info card component, what you're going to see is that's going to render to this page. I'm going to refresh, and then we see the info card. So that's great and all, but the whole idea of components in React kind of revolves around being able to reuse components. So what if I want to do multiple info cards on this page? Well, I can render out a few of them, and then we come back and we see a few of them, but all three of them are exactly the same, which is probably not what you're actually going to want in an application. You're probably going to want to render some different titles and some different content for these cards. And this isn't specific to info cards. It's for any component you make. You're going to want to be able to kind of customize them and reuse them all around your application if necessary. So how can we customize these components? Well, the way I like to think about components, which I've covered in my components video on React, the way I like to think about them is that they're just JavaScript functions here. So you can see info card is equal to this anonymous function, this JavaScript function, and they're just JavaScript functions that return HTML, or they return some UI. Now, this isn't technically HTML, it's JSX, but at the end of the day, it gets converted into HTML and rendered to the page. So they're just JavaScript functions that return some UI. Now, how do we customize JavaScript functions? Like, how do you tell a function effectively to return something a little bit different? Well, you pass arguments to those functions. And in React, components work a very similar way. We can effectively pass arguments to these components via props. And what props look like are very similar to HTML attributes. So in our JSX here, we're setting these class names on these JSX elements. These class names here would be considered JSX attributes. And you can see when I hover over it, it's going to have the HTML attributes type. And then you could do different things like, if I had an HTML input, it might be type text. So my attribute is type. Well, very similar to adding attributes to components, we can add props. So if I add title is equal to info card title, it looks just like an HTML attribute, but this is considered a React prop. And if we go to our info card, we can accept this via the props object. So right here, passing this attribute is effectively like passing an argument to the info card function. And then within info card, we accept a props object here. So React is automatically going to pass all of the attributes here on a props object. So we're going to be able to access, and I'm going to make this, I'm going to put square brackets around here, and then I'm going to just say return, so we can console.log the props. So if I open my console, you're going to see I render 3 different props objects here, and you can see props is an object. One of them has a title property with info card title. Because I'm rendering 3 different info card components, but I'm giving one of them the title of info card title. So you can see the attributes I add here are passed on a props object in which the name of the attribute corresponds to a property on the props object. So if I add another attribute here, so I'm going to say content is equal to my info card content, and then I save that, you're going to see I render out 3 different props here because I'm rendering out 3 different components. But one of the components, the props object, has 2 properties now, title and content, and they correspond to these attributes I pass here. So these attributes that I pass into this component are passed along on the props object as an argument to the component. So then I can use these within the component. So instead of just rendering this hard-coded title, I can render props.title, and then instead of rendering this content, I can render props.content. And now if we go back to our page, you can see 2 of my cards have nothing here because in 2 of my components, I'm not passing a title and content attribute, which is going to be passed on the props object that I can access with a corresponding name. So props.title, it corresponds to this title attribute. Props.content corresponds to this content attribute. But since I'm not rendering title and content on these 2 info cards, we see just 2 blank cards here. But in our top card, we see info card title and my info card content because that's what I pass as props here. And those effectively get passed as arguments on a props object to this info card component. Now, one thing that you're going to see a lot is destructuring props right here within the parentheses of your component. So the way that this would work is if I'm expecting a title and content prop, instead of just accepting props here, I can use curly braces, and then I can accept title and content. So this is just a JavaScript thing. It is accepting, and I'm going to remove this console log of props, and I'm also going to remove props.title and just use title, and remove props.content and just use content. But this is just a JavaScript thing. I'm accepting a props object, and I'm destructuring the title and content properties from that props object, which allows me to just use them directly within my component. And if we come back, we see we get the same result, but it's just a little bit cleaner here. And you know what you tend to forget if you're a beginner is putting the curly braces around this. So you make sure to use destructuring syntax to destructure title and content from the props object, or whatever attributes you pass, destructure the correct properties with destructuring syntax. Now, what if you want to make sure that you don't render just like empty cards here or empty components, and you want to give your props default values? Well, it's the same thing with JavaScript destructuring. And I'm going to close my console here. What I can do is I can say the default title is just some title. So I'm just using title is equal to this string. And then the content, well, it's just equal to some info card content. So I'm giving these 2 default values, just using the same syntax you would with destructuring in JavaScript. So if I come back, you see now my info card, where I actually pass the title and content attributes to, that has the customized title and content. But the other two, since I don't pass the title and content, they just contain the default title and content, some title and some info card content, what you see here. But if I want to customize those, well, I can just add a title here. So title is equal to custom info card title, and then content is equal to custom info card content. And now what we should see is one of our info cards has info card title and my info card content. The second info card has these corresponding title and content here. And then the third one just has the default info card title and content. If we look at that, that's exactly what we see here. So you can use the default values for your props, and those are only going to be the values for this component or for your component if you don't pass the attributes on your component. And these attributes at the end of the day are just going to be passed as arguments to your component on the props object, or they're going to be passed as properties on the props object, which are going to work like just passing arguments to a function. One thing that you really want to make sure not to do, or not to attempt to do, is to mutate your props. Props represent just like a single snapshot in time, and they will be reevaluated when a component re-renders, but you should not mutate them. So if I try to do like title is equal to just a weird case of strings here, you're going to see that now they're like all just changed to this weird case of strings, and like my default values don't work anymore. And then also my actual attributes don't work anymore. So don't change your props. If you find yourself needing to change some like values and have those values be dynamic or conditionally different values, what you're going to want to do in that situation is use some React state. You're not actually going to want to mutate your props. So keep your props read-only, don't mutate your props. And if you need to have dynamic values, that's where you're going to want to use React state. Now, one thing I want to show you that you're probably going to see quite a bit is forwarding props. Let me show you it first, and then I'll provide a caveat. So you might find yourself in some situations where you want to create like a wrapper component that maybe it wraps around this info card and provides some sort of customization to it. So in components here, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to create info card wrapper.jsx. And then I'm going to say const info card wrapper is equal to, and it's going to accept props here. I'm not going to destructure it right now. And then we'll do the arrow syntax. And what I'll do here is maybe for my info cards, I want to render like a button to close my info cards, but for some reason, I want that to be a wrapper to where like maybe only if a user is logged in, I want to show them that button. So here I could be like, const is logged in, and then this could be some logic to see if a user is logged in. But for now, I'll just say true, and then we'll return React fragment, and then I will say if they are logged in, so is logged in, then I will render out a button that will say close card. But if they're not logged in, then we won't show the button. Now, this is just for example purposes. The logic here isn't necessarily what you would actually do in an application, but it should get the point across. But now, let's say I want to render out a info card component. So info card, and I'm going to import info card from info card, but I need to render out the props here. So if I'm just going to render out my info card wrapper, I'm probably going to want to send it like a title and content prop, but say I don't want to do like title and content. And if there were several props, I might need to do, a bunch of other things. So like button, text, and say my info card component had a bunch of other props here that I'm typing out. That might get a little bit tedious to do. So instead of doing this, what you can do is just accept props, and then you can spread your props into the info card component. So I can just spread these props like this. Because remember, props is going to be an object, and then I can just use JavaScript to spread that object into this info card component. This is commonly called forwarding props. And if you haven't seen it before, it looks a little bit weird, but at the end of the day, we're just using JavaScript here to take this props object and spread the properties and values into this info card. So if this props object contains a title and a content property, we're going to assign the property title as an attribute to this info card, and the same thing with content. So let me console log these props here, and then let's render within our page.jsx. Let's render an info card wrapper. So I'm going to do info card, and I think we need to export it. So let me make sure to do that. Export default, info card wrapper, and then let's go render it. Info card wrapper. And then now I can pass a title is equal to info card wrapper title. Content is info card wrapper content. And now if we look, we see a close card button, which doesn't make a ton of sense, but that's what we wanted for this wrapper component. But we still see info card wrapper and info card wrapper content. So our props are working correctly. And if I open my console, we see my props in my info card wrapper here that we're console logging have a title and content property. And then we're just spreading those props into the info card, which is going to work because the info card expects us to have a title and content value, and we can just spread those into the info card component. So we're just kind of forwarding these props. Now, the caveat on this is that this isn't always the most readable thing. Like if you're new to React and you haven't seen this, you might be like, what in the heck is going on here? But this is the very same thing, is doing something like, instead of spreading them here, I could say title is equal to props.title, and then content is equal to props.content. And that's the very same thing. And if we come back, we see everything works the same. And then we could even do the same destructuring up here for title as well as content. And then we no longer need to access that on the props object. And that's going to work the same way as well. But props is not defined, so I will get rid of that as well. But you see, that still works. And I think that this can be a lot more readable, which is why I tend to still use this approach. But just know that you're going to see that forwarding props of ... props quite a bit. And that's all that's going on there. And it can be really nice to where, like I said, if I had like several other props that I'm destructuring, prevents me from needing to like just continue to add all those attributes manually here, which can get a little bit tedious to do. And sometimes forwarding props makes a lot of sense. You just have to kind of know what's going on there. Now, one final thing to cover here is children. What we're going to do is for this info card wrapper, instead of just rendering an info card here, I'm going to remove that. I'm going to also remove both of these here, and I'm just going to accept props here. But now below my button, I'm just going to render props.children. And I'm going to also console.log props.children. Now, what is children? Well, children is going to be anything that I pass as a child to my info card component. So in page.jsx here, I'm no longer going to be sending these props to the info card wrapper. I want to render the info card as a child to my info card wrapper. So the way I'm going to do this is instead of just having a self-closing component, I'm going to have an opening element and a closing element here. And then I'm going to render my info card within the opening and closing element. So I'm going to render info card like so. And I'm going to say the title is info card child. And then the content is going to be info card child content. So now I have my info card wrapper, the opening and closing elements, and then I'm just rendering info card as a child to my info card wrapper or between the opening and closing elements. In a very similar way that like this header here has this h1 as a child to this header component or this header HTML element. We can use like the same sort of DOM structure logic to render this info card as a child to this info card wrapper. And the way that we're going to access this is going to be on the props.children object. So if I come back to my info card wrapper and I open my console here, you're going to see that my props.children, it's going to be a React element because I'm rendering my info card title. And you can see on my props.children, the type is an info card function. And then it has the props of title and content of info card child content and info card child. So I access my children on props.children. So if I come back here and I decide to render another card within info card wrapper, or say I want to render an H2, because you can render other React components as children, or you can render JSX element. I can type some stuff out and I can save this. And then now we're going to see my props.children is going to be this React component that we see right here. But we also render this H2 as a child to info card wrapper. So this is also going to be an element of type H2 that has this content. Because even in this JSX component, this text that we're rendering within it is going to be the children to this JSX element here. So both of these are going to be on the props.children of our info card wrapper. And if we look at the UI here, we see we render info card child content, and then our H2. And that's being rendered within this info card wrapper. And maybe to make this more clear, I'll make this a div here, and then I will set a style in which the border 1 pixel solid black. I think that might work. And then you can see it kind of has a border here, but maybe I'll make it a little bit bigger. Maybe I'll do 10 pixels and then I'll do solid red. So here you can see my info card wrapper is rendering the button, the info card child, and this H2. And I'm rendering all those by just rendering out my props.children and this button right here. So if I pass more things into this info card wrapper here, I'm going to keep rendering them as children. So this is now going to render this paragraph. And if I look at this, we see it renders this paragraph. So anything that you pass within your component tags here, so within the opening and closing tags, you can access that content or those JSX or other React components. You can access those on the props.children value because that's automatically going to be passed on the props object, and it's going to be on the .children property. And of course, we can use the same destructuring syntax. I can just destructure children on my props object, and then here we can just render out children. And we see we have the same effect here. Props.children, it can be a little bit tricky, but once you start using it, it can be really nice and it does come in handy. Just remember that anything that you pass as a child or within the opening and closing tags of a React component, you can access those on the children property of the props object that is automatically going to be passed to your component. And that can also help you further customize your React components. So that should give you a pretty good understanding of how props work in React. If there's anything I missed or anything that you have a question about, let me know in the comments below. But thanks for tuning into this, and I'll see you in that next one.